Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today in our 91st episode of the Clements Bookworm. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library. Today's meeting will be recorded to share online, and later today you'll receive an email with that recording and any of the resources mentioned during today's broadcast. If you're joining us for the first time or need a little reminder, we are delighted to have you use the chat. Just remember to change the setting to everyone. And my colleague Katie will be monitoring the chat and pasting things in that might be of interest to you. Since there's so much going on in the chat, please remember to use the Q&A section for any questions that you have. You can also see other people's questions and give it a thumbs up to reorder those questions so we know what to focus on first. We have the machine captions turned on today, and you can toggle those on or off or change the size as needed. And of course, play around with your screen because we can only control so much of what you see. So hopefully you can make the slides a good size for you and move the people around so they're not in the way of the slides. And yeah, so thanks for being here. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of the history and culture of North America and the Caribbean to about 1900. And I want to take a few moments to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. And today we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. I invite you to take a look at the story map that will be pasted into the chat and provided later, because the Inclusive Histories project here on campus has done a really interesting website to really look at this history. And so some of you might find that really interesting. All right, this is your last chance to click very fast. And then I'm going to end the poll and share the results. All right, so family records definitely did indeed end up winning out. It was leader all along, and I think that sort of makes sense for knowing, you know, how much all of you value history, that you would want to keep your own history together. But looks like Cheney's handwritten notes get an honorable mention, and of course books as well. So thank you everybody for participating in that poll. It's always interesting to think about these things together. And I would like to thank Doug Johnson, who has generously sponsored today's episode. Thanks, Doug, for always tuning in to the Bookworm and for helping us out in this way. Today, we're joined by the Clements Curator of Manuscripts, Cheney Chouperet, who will be in conversation with author Dr. Derek O'Leary. So Cheney, I'm happy to turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. O'Leary. Derek holds a PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley. Previously, he taught at Bard High School Early College and the University of South Carolina. He was a Presidential Management Fellow in the federal government and now serves as academic director at the Archer Center, the Washington, D.C. campus for the University of Texas System, where he collaborates with staff and faculty to ensure Archer Fellows have a transformative educational experience. His recent book, Archival Communities: Constructing the Past in the Early United States, draws on research conducted at the Library of Congress and the National Archives. Derek, welcome, and I look forward to learning more about your work. I'll pass it to you.
Well, thank you, Cheney, and thank you everyone at Clements for the kind invitation. It's such a pleasure to speak with you all, to read already about your own relationship with historical materials. I was intrigued by the poll. I think had we polled Americans somehow in 1826, we might have received somewhat similar responses that family records were of primary concern for preservation. I'll see if I can weave that back in a little bit later. I'm delighted to have the chance to speak with you all today. I'll share some simple slides for us to look at as I speak with you all. Uh, as Cheney mentioned, I work at the Archer Center. It's something like the campus for the University of Texas system. So all of the campuses within the system are eligible, students coming from those campuses are eligible to apply to become fellows here in Washington, D.C. They come to D.C., they spend a semester working in an internship, typically in public service or something related to policy, and then they take courses. And one of those courses, which is near and dear to my heart, is called The Politics of National Memory. As the title suggests, it's a course that gives students a chance to examine the ways that Americans have thought about their history over time, contested their history, the way that history influences our politics and politics influences our sense of history. We have one fantastic faculty member who's taught this course for a number of years now, and he's found himself in the habit of saying at the beginning of every semester, I could not imagine a more interesting and relevant time to examine this topic. So it's a little, funny in a way that it always seems to be a relevant, important topic for us to dig into. How do we understand history? How do we construct history? What does our understanding of history show about us? How does our understanding of history influence us? It's one that the students get excited about. And I think, again, had he been able to teach this class for the past 250 years, he might have been saying the same thing every single semester, that it's always a relevant and timely moment to try to make sense of the ways that Americans, not to mention people from around the world, understand this nation's history and what the stakes of that are. This question always intrigued me as a teacher, and it's what led me to this research topic that led eventually to this book. How have we been doing this over the past now 250 years? And I was intrigued early on in the research to find that from the earliest days of the nation, from the advent of the revolution into independence, through the tumultuous period of national expansion and the Civil War and onward, Americans have been asking, what is our history? What does our history mean for us? Not just for our understanding of the past, but for how we perceive ourselves as a political community in the moment and what that entails for the future. Scholars have found all sorts of fascinating points of entry into this topic. We have wonderful studies about pageantry in the early United States, the use of parades and other embodied forms of history around holidays like the 4th of July. I happen to be in front of Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., a block or so from the White House, and we're expecting major displays around the 250th 4th of July, just in 2 months' time. This has been going on since the early days of the Republic in different forms. Scholars have looked into the vibrant world of art and visual materials that depicted history. If you go to the US Capitol and stand in the rotunda, it's really 360 degrees of historical narratives, historical paintings, friezes, other attempts to tell the nation's history. Of course, historical novels, poetry, other forms of written history are great ways to try to access this bigger and often amorphous concept of historical consciousness. That is how people think about their history, how they perceive themselves in history, what that means for them in their lives. It's a fascinating topic, and the way that I chose to examine it, and which I'll share about today, is through the world of papers, historical materials that from the very early days of the Republic, certain Americans began to gather and, in particular, attempt to preserve through institutions, namely historical societies, which I'll say much more about, in order to serve what they perceived as a vital civic need to bring the nation's papers together in one place, to preserve them for posterity, so that Americans could make sense of what their history was. From the 1790s, when we have the first historical societies, I saw somebody from Worcester, Massachusetts in the chat. So Boston, Massachusetts housed the first historical society in 1791. And then through the end of the antebellum period, we had maybe 60, hard to count, what the full number, but maybe 60 or so historical societies or similar learned institutions whose primary function was to gather historical materials, preserve them, make them available to the public, or at least some portions of the public, in different ways, either to researchers who came to access them directly through publication of selected materials which circulated throughout the country, indeed beyond national boundaries. These became the sites that I was most curious about. They tend to be underrated institutions in a way in this period, and my hope in this project was to illuminate them and show the vital work that they were engaged in, uh, and in particular, dig into the collections that they were building to pursue this bigger task of preserving the nation's history and the types of narratives that emerge from those collections. The vision of history, the notion of history that people could understand when looking at these materials. As I was saying before with our class on the politics of national memory, even if historical societies and the many members who worked for them, who depended on them, who read their publications or engaged with them in some other way, even if they were bound together by a shared sense in the importance of this purpose, there were many sites of contestation, disputes over where materials belonged, what was the right place, what was the right institution to hold given historical materials, such as family papers or a journal or newspapers. What narratives should be emphasized and which narratives should be excluded from these institutions? What actors would be featured, what points of history would be emphasized, and which would be left on the margins? Who would belong to these institutions? Who would have the authority to do this? All of these questions were contested in interesting ways through this period. And so while I want to kind of point us towards the larger context, the forerunner in the way of places like the Clements Library, and I'm guessing many of you live in communities where it's driving distance to your nearest historical society, whether local or state. I want to look at that early history and show that from the very beginning, these have been challenging questions. These have been questions that many Americans have seen as essential to understanding their place, not just historically, but in the present and looking toward the future. So to do that, I want to focus not so much on the papers themselves, which are one way of telling this story. We could look at all of the individual papers that were gathered over time, as well as quite a few fascinating objects that found their way into archives. We could look at the institutions themselves, the historical societies that created structures, rules of membership, processes, built physical collections. I want to use a few interesting figures from this period to help bring us into this world of archives in the early United States, and illuminate what this work actually looked like, what was at stake. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of what the book resembles and how these four characters who I'll introduce to you all fit into it. I found out early on in the process that Americans were interested in history at various levels. And I'm curious if this resonates for anyone listening today. Uh, on one of these, we might say the biggest level, Americans found themselves interested in global history, how the United States, how they as individuals or communities or states fit into the larger history of the world. At the same time, Americans were distinctly interested in their nation's own history. What is the distinctive history of our country coming into formation, expanding rapidly, changing dramatically in a demographic sense, in a political, social, cultural sense? And so, of course, there was curiosity about how we tell the nation's history itself within that global context. At the same time, there was a huge amount of energy that went into telling the particular history of states. I think many of us know that the United States, then as now in different ways, was a federation of states that had their own colonial histories, own distinctive sense of identity. And a lot of the organizing of early archives focused on collecting the specific history of that state and, where relevant, the colony that the state had emerged from. So Americans were thinking on the level of the state too. What is the history of our state? And then lastly, the fourth of these, we might call them frames or concentric circles that I'll show us, was the local level. Local history emerged, it burgeoned as a field. Innumerable local histories were written through this period. And in some ways, the local history, if not the best funded, if not the most notable, was the most important to many Americans. How are people, how is our community tethered to our local space, the geography, the history of our local space? And then again, how did our local space fit into these other levels that I've described? The history of the state, the history of the nation, indeed, the history of the world. So I want to introduce you to four individuals who help us see these different levels of historical collecting, of historical thinking that archives were involved in the early United States. I'm hopeful that they're new acquaintances. I'll be curious if you've come across any of them in your own work, and happy to learn more about what you think about each of them. But I'll introduce them in turn, describe them fairly briefly, and then certainly would love to hear questions or comments that explore any of these in some more detail. Please meet Carl Christian Raffin. Now, it might seem a bit peculiar to start a discussion about American archives with a figure, to my knowledge, who never stepped foot in the United States. Raffin, depicted here, was a Danish scholar, a polymath, a linguist, philologist, a historian, an archaeologist, and in the 1820s, the founding member of the major learned society that emerged in Denmark in this period, called the Royal Society of Northern Antiquaries. This brought together some of the brightest, most productive minds in Scandinavia. And the core idea that animated Raffin and organized the early work of this society was a belief he had about the discovery, as he put it, of America. Now, the prevalent notion in the early 1800s among Americans was that Columbus was the quote unquote discoverer of America. We see Columbus immortalized not just in books and literal historical narratives and paintings, but in place names, people's names throughout the country. This was a well-established assumption, the foundation for many Americans of where their history started, but also where the most pivotal event in global history had happened. And that's how many at the time saw it. Carl Christian Raffin had another theory. His theory was that it was, in fact, not Columbus and his crew in the 15th century, but Norse discoverers, Scandinavian discoverers in the late 10th century, and then subsequently in the 11th century. He was convinced that there was an entire trail of evidence, both archaeological and archival manuscripts, that were scattered across the North Atlantic, from Scandinavia through Iceland and Greenland into the contemporary United States. Some even believed that evidence of Norse exploration went as far south as Brazil, and they sponsored expeditions to look for it. Raffin was certain that this evidence should prove, both to Europeans and to Americans, that American history truly started at that moment in the 10th century. Now, of course, and Angela rightly acknowledged the indigenous history of Michigan, but also we could say of the broader what's become the Eastern United States. This, of course, implied that anything predating European arrival was not within the bounds of history. It was somehow prehistoric or non-historical. So he's showing a common assumption at the time that held both European and American dominant beliefs together. Uh, and he's using this argument to contest this well-established belief within the United States. To do so, Raffin establishes contact with historical societies. Those are his first points of contact in the United States in the 1820s, and he reaches out. He's a prolific letter writer. He's constantly writing in multiple languages to key individuals in the United States who work at these historical societies, who are either members or their officers, who are themselves notable collectors, either genealogists or historians. And from the 1820s, he begins drumming up support for this theory. Our society is examining this historical period. We're gathering evidence, and we're going to publish a major book, he writes, that is justifying in unequivocal terms that this is what happened. And Americans are excited. This, for many Americans, and I'll share an example of one here, is an intriguing concept. Americans, in many ways, were proud of their history. They were proud of the newness, the extraordinary changes in their history, but some at the same time felt a sense of deficit in relationship to Europe, a sense that they lacked an intriguing, a compelling, a dramatic history prior to colonization by Europeans, mostly in the 17th century. And so this Norse theory for some Americans seemed to open up their archives, seemed to suggest that there was a broader set of documents, that there was a broader narrative that took their history several centuries back in time from where they typically started it in the 17th century. And so many Americans joined the Northern Society of Royal Antiquaries. They paid dues. They eagerly awaited the publication of this book by Raffin. And for those dues-paying members, they received this elaborate diploma. And we have to imagine this being shipped from Northern Europe across the ocean. It usually went through the hands of a Danish diplomat or consular officer before making its way, in this case, to John Farmer, leading genealogist in the early United States, who corresponded with Raffin and was excited about what this meant for America's archives, for the history of America and American identity as a whole. Now, Raffin's book eventually appeared in 1837. It was a mammoth thing. Most of it is written in Danish and Latin. Very few Americans might have even been able to read it, but the theory circulated. It appeared in popular lectures, in kind of shorter form in English, and many Americans responded eagerly to it. They analyzed it, they picked it apart, they questioned some of the evidence, they engaged actively with this foreign entity, and they thought seriously about what this meant for their history, for the materials that built America's archive, that should inform it by the narrative that all of this could support. It's a complicated intellectual history, what they actually did with this theory. Many came to doubt it in the early United States, though it has a longer life, which there's much to say about as well. So on this global level, we can see already that American archives are not isolated. They're connected with scholars abroad, they're connected with materials and other languages from other periods, and they're actively thinking about what goes into our archive, what does not go into our archive. What narrative of our country do these materials support, and what narrative do they not support? Let's go to that second layer that I talked about, the national level. So while Americans remained curious and interested in these global questions of where America fit within global history, they were, of course, preoccupied too with the distinctive archive and the distinctive history of the United States. Now, this is an interesting contrast with Europe at the time as well. There is no national archive in the early United States. It would not be until the very end of the 19th, early 20th century that history professionalizes as a discipline, that the federal government becomes more involved in the work of officially gathering and preserving and making available public documents. In the early United States, there is no centralized body in Washington, D.C. that takes on major responsibility for this. You do have the Library of Congress, you have other federal agencies that collect materials, but nothing on the order of what existed in Europe. It's somewhat in this vacuum of federal involvement in the work of collecting papers that individuals, particularly Jared Sparks, attempts to collect materials that could serve in a way like a national archive. Now, this isn't a brick and mortar archive the way that we might think of it now, but Sparks, from the 1820s through the rest of his life, becomes almost monomaniacally at times involved in the work of comprehensively collecting, publishing, making sense of the materials of George Washington. Now, Washington's writings were scattered to an extent. You can find his papers in historical societies across the early United States. Many individuals had gathered letters, in some cases, scraps of Washington's clothing or other belongings from Mount Vernon, which became a wildly popular historical site. But his papers are left somewhat unattended at Mount Vernon. Myriad papers, volumes of the documentary record of his that he developed in his early life amid the American Revolution during his presidency and afterward. Jared Sparks, kind of in the absence of any one state that could claim authority over this and lacking a big federal investment in doing something with Washington's archive, he takes it upon himself and he sees in Washington's materials the potential to tell the nation's story, to get at the nation's historical identity, to make available to the nation these vital papers, which so far had been largely unexamined, though there are a few cases of individuals studying them, publishing portions, writing histories of Washington. Sparks spends an entire decade. He starts at Mount Vernon and strikes a deal with George Washington's heir, Bushrod Washington, who had inherited these papers as well as the estate of Mount Vernon. He strikes a deal with him, convinces him to relinquish control of the papers for a time, and he undertakes to comprehensively go through, to select, to edit. Some historians have argued to edit too enthusiastically, to kind of smooth some of Washington's rougher edges at time, but to ultimately publish in durable form Washington's writings, which appear in the 1830s as a series of 12 volumes called The Writings of George Washington. This is the first major publication of Washington's papers. They bring these before the public in a new way. This is a cover page on the left, and on the right, an intriguing page from one of the early volumes, which I just find thought-provoking. These are a series of Washington's autographs that Sparks had collected, and he assembles them here in chronological order from top to bottom, almost like a statue, a timeline of Washington's life, but almost like a pillar of Washington's writing. So it's almost as if we're seeing the individual, to get back to Cheney's earlier comment about the power of handwriting and what it expresses about individuals. It's almost as if we're seeing the individual Washington on the page here. Now, Sparks was on archive himself. He worked among historical societies, was in close communication with them. He traveled at several points to Europe to make copies of materials that he thought were vital to telling Washington's history and the broader history of the Revolution. But it's through his work, its promotion of Washington's writings, that the federal government, for the first meaningful time, gets involved in the work of collecting historical materials. And it does so in the later 1830s by purchasing a large portion of Washington's writings from his estate in the amount of $25,000, a huge sum of money for an archival preservation project. Those become the property of the State Department and later find their way to the Library of Congress, where they are today. But Sparks was working in a complicated context, one in which there was no clear national authority responsible for preserving and telling American history, one in which there was a great amount of popular interest, and in which an individual like him could navigate these different institutions, access these documents, but ultimately have a meaningful impact on the role that the federal government would increasingly play in the work of preserving history. I want to turn to the third of these frames that I've mentioned. At the very time that Americans were intrigued by this Norse theory that Raffin was presenting in the very years where Sparks was moving around the country, gathering Washington's papers and then publishing those through his volumes. The greatest energy, I would say, that went into the effort to preserve Americans' historical materials was at the state level. Of course, Americans identified in different ways with their national identity, some with a perhaps global identity as well. But most Americans were particularly interested in the distinctive history of their state within that larger national or global history. And it's on the state level, through historical societies that focus on the history of the state, through different levels of investment from state governments in the work of historical societies and collecting writ large, that we see a huge amount of interest. The gathering of materials, the publication of selected materials about the history of the state. This happens in different ways in different states, and an intriguing aspect of it is that while states might largely have shared senses of what the nation's history was, they sought to distinguish themselves from each other. Massachusetts Historical Society, the American Antiquarian Society, New York Historical Society, or for instance, here, the Kentucky Historical Society, all sought to gather materials that would illuminate something special about their state's colonial and early history, their state's emergence and its progress, and that would serve to distinguish it from that of other states. Edward Jarvis is one of the many fascinating figures who was involved in this work. He hailed from Massachusetts. He was a doctor. He went to Harvard, intended to be a physician in the Boston area, but he struggled to find work. He was closely connected with his community. He lived in Concord, Massachusetts, mainly, where he was involved in all variety of organizations. Not a member of a historical society, but surely aware of the work of historical collecting. He helped develop the library collection in Concord. And in the late 1830s, struggling to find adequate employment in Massachusetts, he decides to leave for Kentucky. Not an uncommon thing to do at this period for younger men thinking to make their fortune or have better economic prospects. And in the 1830s, he travels westward and lands in Louisville, Kentucky, a booming city, rapidly transforming. And one of the first things he does on the margins of his busy life as a physician and member of the medical community is he helps to found a historical society. Now, this is a peculiar choice. He's not from Kentucky, he has no lineage connecting him to the state. He's from Massachusetts. But he finds in the history of Kentucky itself something compelling. He finds in the opportunity to build a membership and an organization to preserve that history a worthy civic goal. And to judge by his writing, it might have been the aspect of his life there that he found most personally fulfilling for him. He helped build the membership. He helped to circulate an important document in the history of archives, circular letters like this, which were a sort of wish list of items that the Kentucky Historical Society hoped to gather. And he ultimately became a sort of archival institution himself. Now, states had very different fortunes in terms of supporting archives. You had some like New York, which made major investments in the work of gathering documents. They even commissioned a special archival mission to Europe, to the Netherlands, to France and England, to gather copies of historical materials about New York, which they then sent back and celebrated and republished. They had a state level official who was responsible for historical archives. Not every state was like that, though, and some, such as in Kentucky, were a bit tenuous. They struggled to get state support. They struggled to maintain the enthusiasm of their members. Yet they were still motivated by this desire to capture what they saw as the distinctive history of the state, which for Jarvis and others was grounded in the experience of what they called the pioneer generation in the late 18th century. What they primarily were interested in collecting, so as to distinguish their state. And so they circulated documents like this to the public, published them in newspapers in the effort to generate donations. They made a call that was familiar to historical societies across the country. I'll just read from the first paragraph here. To promote these objects, the society earnestly solicit the aid of the liberal, the patriotic, and the learned, and request all who feel disposed to encourage their design to contribute to their library or cabinet, such books, papers, documents, etc., as the following. And then they lay out the list of the particular items they want. Now, Jarvis actually becomes the archive in a sense. He has a medical practice where he often finds himself sleeping, and that at points becomes the place where he actually stores all the archival materials that come in, and they receive thousands of volumes, letters, printed materials, other objects. Not the best place for an archive. I think our Clements colleagues would agree. But a reflection on the one hand of the amount of interest that this provoked, the civic buy-in that many had in this project, but also the challenge of maintaining these institutions. Jarvis has a long and fascinating life after this. He decides to leave Kentucky, and he brings with him quite a few of the materials that he had gathered on behalf of the Historical Society, it seems. He lands back in Massachusetts, but that's another story. So we have these three levels so far, going from the global with Raffin, the national, kind of illuminated by Sparks and his work on Washington's papers, and then this very active state-based historical collecting that Jarvis was involved in. I want to share about the last, and you might say the smallest scale of these, which is the local level of historical collecting and historical writing. This did not generate the front page news that Raffin did, and indeed he was discussed in the press. His notices of his book circulated, celebrating the release of it, trying to build curiosity. He did not make the amount of money, for instance, that local historians did not make the amount of money that Sparks did. For instance, he was able to strike a deal with the Washington estate, and then with the federal government to make a certain amount of money from the publication of those books, which became very influential, and historians of all sorts turned to them to understand Washington and his world. Local historians did not have the same sort of support from their states that even in Kentucky, Jarvis enjoyed. There was no financial support. There was no use of public spaces, such as at a state house, for local historians. But in some ways, local historians did the most consequential work when it came to collecting historical materials and making sense of their meaning in this period. And they did so through their proximity and the nuance of their knowledge about the local sites that they wrote about. They did so at the same time through the creation of norms around scholarship, the mutual support they offered each other, the rigorous standards they had about what was and wasn't factual. A lot of this developed at the local level, and one fascinating figure in this history, who I wish were better known, is Frances Manwaring Calkins. Now, Calkins isn't exactly representative of all local historians in that she was a woman, operating largely in a field of men who wrote local histories, engaged with institutions, in particular the Massachusetts Historical Society, whose membership was fully male, was led by members who, in many cases, were highly influential in the broader world of the 19th century. Judges, politicians, elite economic figures, clergy, etc. But she becomes a very influential figure because of the effectiveness of her research and the quality of her writing. In the 1840s, she reaches out to an important figure at the Massachusetts Historical Society named James Savage. He was a very prominent banker in Massachusetts. He'd been involved with the Massachusetts Historical Society for decades as one of its leaders, very notable genealogist of New England in this period. And Calkins reaches out to him, kind of cold calls him or cold emails him, though with a letter, and introduces herself, introduces her projects that she's conducting research for about the local history of the Connecticut towns where she spent most of her life. And she effectively engages Savage in a scholarly exchange. She asks him, from his vantage point in this really leading historical society in Massachusetts, at the center of a network of other historians and genealogists and collectors, for help informing her research project for specific genealogical facts or other questions, and she in turn shares information with Savage. And this is often dense genealogical factual information which they exchange over the course of many years. From 1845 towards the end of their lives in the 1860s, they're in regular correspondence, talking about their respective projects, trying to get down to the very truth of the history of the communities that she's examining, and which appear in these are her two major books: History of Norwich, which first came out in 1845, the History of New London, Connecticut, which came out in 1852. Uh, Savage, exceptionally, nominates Calkins to become a member of the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1849. This makes her only the second woman, to my knowledge, to be nominated as a member of a historical society before the Civil War. It would be a long time before the Massachusetts Historical Society nominated another woman to be a member. So I have an extraordinary endorsement of her work, of the contributions that she's made to the world of history writing, of archival gathering and writing history. You can maybe sense her change in status and her growth in confidence as a historian when you compare the title pages of these two books. You'll notice History of Norwich, which appears in 1845, is authored by Miss F.M. Calkins. By 1852, when she's a member of the Massachusetts Historical Society, more established within the network of local historical writers, many of whom turn to her as an authority. Uh, the authorship is by Francis Manmore and Calkins. So this local level, in some ways, I would argue, was the one that people connected with most intimately. You can sense this in the way that she wrote and the way that readers responded to her. It was through local history that many Americans could connect with the history of their own communities, of their own families, of places that they knew and cared about. But this local history writing was in interesting ways connected with all these other frames of history that the book explores. The local history of New London fit into the broader history of the state of Connecticut, which the Connecticut Historical Society and other entities sought to capture and make sense of. One might read, and Calkins does, in the history of a town in Connecticut, the larger narrative of the nation, of settlement, of expansion, of growth, of conflict and resolution. One could even read in these local histories broader narratives about the place of America within the globe. So these different levels that I've tried to illuminate briefly, we're all operating at the same time, drawing in this array of figures who are fascinated by the past, who believe in the importance of gathering its history, and who built institutions and practices which, if still inchoate in this period, will, over the course of the 19th century, help to support the emergence of the field of history. And in a lot of ways, the institutions that we continue to turn to and the narratives that we continue to work with to understand the past. So I appreciate your attention as I shed a spotlight on each of these four figures. I'd be more than happy to hear any questions that come up from you all about these or other themes and topics that I mentioned from the book.
Wonderful, wonderful, Derek. Thank you very much for the book and for the most interesting presentation. Um, to begin our conversation, I was hoping to ask you about another figure in your book, and that's Minister William B. Sprague, a private collector, and sort of what his place in the world of historical societies looks like. Or, I'm interested in people like him, people who passionately collect manuscripts for a personal collection, but don't necessarily have ties to one of these historical societies or
Yeah.
institutions.
I think it's a great question and a helpful way of kind of throwing into relief the work that historical societies were doing. So, William Buell Spragg was a minister as kind of primary vocation, but his lasting mark was in the work of gathering a truly tremendous amount of papers. He was described by Jared Sparks, who I shared about before through his work on Washington's papers. He was described by Sparks as a shark, almost like a sort of ravenous creature who moved across the landscape to different historical sites, households, including Mount Vernon, and gobbled up papers. Uh, Spragg was not interested in telling the narratives that historical societies, for instance, were focused on. To take, for instance, Jarvis and the Kentucky Historical Society, they were interested in promoting a narrative of conquest, of the pioneer generation, of the emergence of Kentucky, the distinctive history of that state. Spragg just wanted to collect autographs of interesting things. He collected Americans' autographs. By that, I mean actual pieces of paper that bore their signature on it. Sometimes this meant literally cutting the signature out of the piece of paper, which would strike fear, I think, in the heart of many archivists, as it now is then. And he compiled these into large books of autographs. These are preserved at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. He was in the world of historical collecting. He was fascinated by it, but he did not approach it in the civic sense that institutions like this really encourage people to do. Now, it can be misleading to focus on the work of historical societies, figures like Sparks or Raffin or Calkins or Jarvis, uh, and suggest that that was the norm for Americans at the time. Many Europeans who visited the United States were galled by Americans' treatment of their historical record. This comes up regularly in European travel logs. De Tocqueville is a well-known one, for instance, who observe that Americans are so swiftly rushing into the future that they can't take the time to preserve their past. And there was a lot of evidence of that people willfully disregarded historical materials, historical sites. In the book, for instance, I talk about indigenous earthworks, structures built by indigenous societies prior to the arrival of Europeans that were knocked over, used to construct roads or other functions. So there was, on one hand, a sort of willful disregard of historical material. There was, on the other hand, this very active institutional approach and civic argument about the importance of collecting historical material, making sense of it. And then in the middle are figures like Spragg, who is has what some might call a mania for collecting, but I think found in the collecting of historical materials a chance to get in touch with those figures through the material itself, a sort of access point, but also I think frankly approached it as a hobby. He exchanged autographs. He talks about autographs uh, with his correspondence the way that someone might talk about Pokemon cards or something today. It's like I've got three Franklins. Like, do you have a Lafayette that we could trade? It's fascinating. And so he has a network that kind of sprawls outside of these formal institutions. He interchanges with particular Europeans who are also autograph collectors. And so there's a struggle in the minds of someone like Sparks, for instance, to bring him more into the fold, to direct his energies toward this sort of civic, patriotic work of gathering materials about the nation's history. Um, so he's a fascinating figure, and there are many materials that aren't where they might have been because of him.
Right. He's a fellow who shows up in many of the places that have done research.
Oh, that's interesting.
Everyone seems to have little bits and pieces of Sprague
I think it,
correspondence here and there.
and I wonder for you all if he's a character type who you see elsewhere in history, a sort of a collector who doesn't fit neatly into the work of an institution or a particular intellectual project, but just wants to gather materials.
Sure. I think of people like Benjamin Gratz or
Hmm.
Thomas Phillips or who
Yes.
are amassing these like extraordinarily large collections of materials. Um, who don't have the institutional ties.
And Phillips and Sprague were correspond. I'll send you some photographs of
Oh, that'd be
their
lovely.
letters later if I can find them.
Oh, that'd be terrific. You know, this project as a whole is it hits homes for institutions like the Clements, you
Hmm.
know, where we continue to actively collect archival materials. So, you know, we're daily reflecting on how our acquisitions might shape the historical record and try to document to the best of our abilities our biases and limitations that we bring to the project. But I thought your book did a fine job of exploring the ways that collection decisions actively shape the stories we tell about ourselves and vice
Hmm.
versa.
Hmm.
Um, you know, the individuals you discussed had particular people and stories in mind. You kind of touched on it, but could you say a few words more
Sure.
about the place of Native American
Hmm.
materials or materials related to African Americana at places like these early institutions?
Certainly. The circular letter that I shared before by Jarvis is just an example of what was a fairly common genre or tool that historical societies used to indicate to the public what they wanted, but also to broadcast what they envision their archive doing. Now, there's an interesting tension like that's behind the question for me. On one hand, historical societies and their members and others who turn to them, which by the way included all of the leading historians of this period, George Bancroft, William Hickling Prescott, who wrote these big histories of the United States and other topics. They all turned to these repositories and these institutions. They presented themselves um, in this way as neutral sites, sites that simply gathered the past. They argued that because of the newness of the United States and the fact that the printing press and sort of the technologies of writing had existed for the whole history of the United States, that they had a distinctive opportunity compared to other countries to comprehensively gather their materials. Now, did they literally mean every last material? Perhaps not, but there was a notion that you would gather everything that was available, preserve it in an archive, and then it would be simply up to the historian to make sense of it. And so that belief is there, and to an extent, I want to take it seriously. And I think it's important to think about it within the larger history of the discipline of history and notions of objectivity and the work of the historian. But on the other hand, it was obviously untrue because they had very particular ideas about what should be gathered. And you can read that if you look closely at any of these circular letters. They have a list of items typically, and those items tend to be like connect the dots of the narrative that they're imagining. And typically among the first items is, to your question, materials related to the first settlement, the founding generation that established whatever would later become the colony or the state, and materials about Native Americans. And their conflicts with that founding generation, or any other evidence of Native American culture, history, life that could be gathered. We see in these historical societies the prevalent notion of the vanishing Indian, which is prolific across American culture in this period. A sense that although indigenous communities continued to exist uh, in the lands that have become the United States, that they will not for long, that they are on the way out, and that the work of the historical societies to gather what materials can be gathered before it's too late, before that evidence is gone. But that's often within the context of telling this larger history of settlement and conquest, of the growth of the European and then European American colonies and later states. The best book on this topic, I believe, is still Gene O'Brien's Firsting and Lasting, which examines historical societies and also in-depth local histories to look at the ways in which these institutions and other people uh, focused on the first thing that the settlers did as the start of history, the kind of the start of the settlement as the start of history, and consequently treated Native America as something that was outside of the bounds of history. At the same time, I'd say there are many members of these societies who are distinctly interested in Native American history, including oral traditions, which Frances Manwaring Calkins, for instance, takes into consideration and writes about in her books. And so there's a genuine curiosity and interest in applying the skills of history to Native American historical materials, but within this larger narrative that sees them as something outside the real trajectory of American history. As far as African American materials, there's less intentional interest in gathering those. Of course, they show up in different ways for historians reading, we might say, against the grain. The great bulk of work of historical societies is in the North in this period, though you do have various Southern efforts, but those tend not to emphasize the place of slavery or intentionally gather materials for that. Though I think it's an important area for further research.
So, lastly, so we can open up
Oh,
the
sure.
conversation to questions, I'm curious if there was anything surprising or unexpected that you came across in the course of your research.
There were so many interesting things. I alluded to it in the discussion of Raffin, and happy to expand on it. The international dynamics of what can seem like very kind of local parochial institutions really, really impressed me. So many of the narratives that Americans were interested in this period depended on them gathering materials that were not in the United States. That were in British or French or Dutch even archives. In the case of Columbus, in Spanish archives, Columbus's papers become available in the 1820s, and Washington Irving is in residence in Spain as a consular officer and goes to the archives and begins examining those. It's hard to understand these collections, the actual materials in the collections, and then the narratives that they're supporting without looking at this bigger international context. One of the most interesting stories in the book is the work about a fairly young man, John Romaine Broadhead, who was appointed by the state of New York around 1840 to go to Europe and paid fairly well for it. Visit the archives in the Netherlands, in France, and in Britain, which was not unprecedented, but quite an uncommon act at the time for a foreigner to be able to access materials that were part of the state's papers in a foreign country. And he had made 80 or so volumes of documents that he and New Yorkers thought was vital to telling the history of New York, from the colonization by the Dutch through the English period and its emergence as an independent state. So that global dynamic really took me aback, and I think is an intriguing one to think about. We think about our national or a local or a state history, but in this period, it really depended on these global exchanges.
Fascinating. I enjoyed your book immensely, by
Oh,
the
that's
way.
nice of you to
Before
say.
I
Thank you.
before I pass along this to Angela.
All right. That was great. Thank you so much. And we have lots of questions in the chat. So I will quickly do a couple of housekeeping announcements, and then we'll get to those. We are about to open up a new exhibit. It opens next Friday, May 22nd, Up and Away, A History of Ballooning in America. So you can visit in person Monday through Friday, noon to 4. And soon there will be an online version of this exhibit as well. And we'll share that with you next month. And you can also see the exhibit during our program, What's in Your Attic, on May 31st. That's a Sunday from 1 to 4 p.m. It's an opportunity to bring in your paper materials and chat with others about it, ask questions of the curators, or just show them off. You can also come without paper materials as well, to see what everybody's showing off on that day. And there is the opportunity for a tour and to see the exhibit. So you can register for that program. Then we have our now annual birthday party. It's our 103rd birthday on June 15th. The ice cream social will be from 4 to 6 p.m. On the front plaza on the south side of the Clements Library. So we hope to see you there. And next month, we'll have historian Kelly Carter Jackson, who will be joining the program to share her research that led to the book We Refuse, A Forceful History of Black Resistance. So if you're new to the Bookworm, you are signed up for the series and will receive an email reminder next month. And then you can choose to join live or to receive the email with the recording and to watch it later. So um, we're always happy to have you involved in a whole variety of ways. And we call our donor community the Clements Library Associates. If you enjoy the work that we do, it's a nice way to get more involved and receive some insider views of the Clements. And if you particularly like the Bookworm program, you can also sponsor an episode of the Bookworm. Today's episode was sponsored by Doug Johnson, and we appreciate you, Doug. Thanks so much. All righty. So lots of great questions. So let me get
Angela,
organized
would you like
here.
me to try to go through them in turn, or
Um,
do you
I
want to pull
can
them out yourself?
Yeah, I can read them out and I'll also see if I can group any of them together. But Miriam was asking about collecting the records of the United States and whether or not you include the government printing office, which collects, publishes, and disseminates the records of Congress and agencies to repositories throughout the states. And where does this agency sit within the historical record?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and I think for the sake of writing a book and conducting research for it, I limited the set of institutions that I could take on and focus more on these more local or state-based institutions, which I felt were more closely connected to individuals and communities and their interest in preserving history and making sense of it. But certainly at the same time, over the course of the 19th century, there are federal institutions that are involved in the work of preserving history, including through the printed word. I was chatting about this with someone at the Senate Historical Office last week. When de Tocqueville visits the United States, including a trip through Washington, he has quite negative things to say about uh, the Capitol's preservation of what's actually going on in Congress, what's going on in the federal government. He says that in like a certain number of years, it will be impossible to tell the history of what happened here because they haven't been actively preserving and including through print the records of Congress. And in a footnote to the American edition of that, the American editor says, "Well, actually, that's not true. We've been printing the records of Congress. They're preserved and disseminated to the states. So that work is going on at the same time. Of course, I think it serves a different function than that many historical societies were engaged in, which was charting the history of whether a community, a town, a state or the larger country, charting its history from what they saw as inception up to the present moment. But I think these phenomena are connected, and the interest in preservation are connected. And many historical societies have agreements where they receive government published materials, the records of Congress, for instance, and include those in their archives.
Nice. It's maybe tangentially related, but
Mhm.
I think this is interesting. Kathleen's wondering what you think the effect of the well, she says centennial, but I'm
Yeah.
assuming she means the
The first
cen
centennial, or
yeah, so I guess that's the question. Is it the
yeah.
first centennial or is it our present day?
Well, I think I could try to answer either. I think that any historical commemoration in U.S. history has been a juncture where there's been more energy and interest in how history has been preserved and understood. The 50th anniversary of the Declaration was for many reasons a significant one. Um, Passing of the revolutionary generation, the expansion of the United States, which dramatically had expanded after the War of 1812. the return of Marquis de Lafayette, and there were a lot of like historical events that were happening then, which made it seem like an important juncture of the passing of Jefferson and Adams on the very same day. It's around that time that we see a profusion of historical societies, a lot more, let's say, historical expression in general, pageantry in the street, the writing of historical literature, paintings, but also more investment in the work of historical societies. And I think this is true in different ways across other anniversaries. In 1876, there's renewed interest in the colonial period. For instance, the 150th, I think there's a little less that's done. Obviously, the bicentennial, which was celebrated over a period of years rather than just a year, mark this. And of course, we're rehearsing this in our own way this year. I think it's different at every moment. And importantly, it reflects the ethos of the time, how people are perceiving themselves in the present, which to Cheney's great earlier question, Americans, our sense of our place in the moment often influences how we look to the past and what sense we make of it. And I think that centennials, bicentennials, et cetera, are often opportunities for that. So it's a great question.
Definitely. Uh, this is an interesting question
Okay.
to think about. Is there a network of historical societies to help one find who has what documents?
That is a great question. I feel like that would be a better question for the Clements Center, who are probably more acquainted with the 21st century archives than I am. There are professional organizations. I was last week at a great conference in DC for the Association of Centers for the Study of Congress, which brings together institutions that have congressional records, the personal papers of former members of Congress. So associations bring professionals together who work in these institutions. And I'm certain there are more out there, and also digital resources, which Clements Center could probably point us to.
Right, right. Yeah, I don't know. Cheney, do you have any other thoughts on that? It's always so hard because you want all of these digital resources to be widely available and interconnected, but it's not that easy.
No, and I don't know about the historical societies in specifically, but when conducting research myself, I find myself having to go to a a plethora of different places looking
Mhm.
for materials. I know from the sort of from the back end, when we create our descriptive catalog records for archival materials, we create them in a way that makes them easily shareable in that get drawn into large databases of them, places like, you know, Archives Grid and OCLC's WorldCat and that sort of thing. But not everybody subscribes to or applies to that. So, it's something I wish existed, a uniform place where we could go to look for all things in manuscripts. Uh, but yeah, I'm afraid I don't have a, a, a clear and successful answer for that.
I know, right? All right. That's what I figured, but I thought that was an interesting one. Um, how about Tom is asking,
Mhm.
was triumphalism of
Yeah.
history a significant motivator for the establishment of historical societies?
It's a great question. And another question where it can be helpful to compare what was happening in the United States to what was happening in other countries, particularly Western Europe, which was what Americans had in mind when they thought about these institutions. There were models of what a historical society or related institution was that emerged in England, Scotland, Ireland, France, Germany, other places. Institutions that served to gather materials of the past. I think that all of those institutions in Europe, which many Americans looked at and said, why don't we have those? They felt a sort of sense of deficit or inadequacy compared with them. They believed in the exceptional nature of their nation, and that was partly what motivated their interest. And I suspect that's always behind the work of gathering history, that you feel like there's something distinctive about your past, whether it's family's past, your communities, or your nations, or what have you. I think it is the case that for historical societies in the United States that emerged in this period, there was a sense of the exceptionalism of what not just their history represented, but of what their materials were that distinguished them from places in Europe. For instance, triumphalism might not have been the word that they used at the time, but as, for instance, the circular letter that I shared before indicated, there was a sense of progress, a sense of extraordinary historical events that distinguished whether it's a town in Connecticut or a state such as Kentucky or the nation as a whole that distinguished it. And that is what justify the collecting of these materials. That's what motivated uh, governors and other politicians, leading figures of finance and letters and religion, law to join these organizations, a sense that they were part of something that was exceptional. Another aspect of what you might call triumphalism, we might call exceptionalism, was not just the narrative, though. It was also a sense that the papers themselves were different. There was something different about the papers that Americans get at. In in the book, I call this archival exceptionalism, a belief that unlike Europe, which people in these institutions tend to caricature a bit, the American past was not one of kings, of nobility, of clergy who dominated life and directed the course of history. It was one that was built by individuals. This was kind of the notion that they had a more democratic history as they understood it. And as such, the documents of, say, 17th century valuable because they supported this larger exceptional history. And so the documents in a way themselves were exceptional, which created an opportunity for any individual family to say, well, the papers in my household deserve to be donated to an archive because they're part through the experiences that the people of the past had. They're part of this larger exceptional trend. So there's a sense that the papers were kind of closer to extraordinary events and themselves were extraordinary, even if very mundane. A sermon delivered in a local setting, an almanac from fill in the blank year, all of that could help to sustain this larger exceptional narrative. So it's a great question. I think it's true on the level of narrative, but also it was part of the argument that these places made. This is why you should not hesitate to donate something to us because it all fits into this larger story. Of course, that again is a notion of what matters, what history matters, and a notion of what history does not matter. And so there are choices being made there too about how the past is perceived.
Well, related to how the pastor's perceived and choices made, I think these two questions of Tom's kind of go hand in hand because
Sure.
he's asking, did history get edited when handwritten documents were selected and transcribed to print?
Yes.
And then also asking about George Washington's
Right.
concern with his legacy, and did he do some self-editing?
It's such a great question, and I think raises larger questions about the authenticity of the records that we continue to turn to today, to the narratives that are built upon that evidence. Yes, is the short answer. I'll give an example. Jared Sparks, who again, this leading collector, editor, the living figure most associated with George Washington's writings in the antebellum U.S. He got into some hot water later in life after he had published these major volumes of Washington's writings, became closely associated. He was turned to as an authority figure on Washington and the Revolutionary period. There began to be criticisms that Sparks had edited Washington's writings when creating these volumes, that he had at different points removed turns of phrases which were ineloquent. He had made grammatical changes. He had perhaps removed content that seemed offensive to him or others for some reason. As Tom rightly notes, Washington himself had been involved in this process during his own lifetime. Reproducing, but in the process also editing and fine-tuning his writings which he envisioned for posterity. Washington, at a point, even described in detail the type of binding that he wanted for his papers. He had a sense of historical materials, not just as discrete facts, but also as a sort of monument to himself, also as a sort of aesthetic object. And you can see that in the case of Washington and others. Sparks gets called out in the 1840s by this very notable British historian named Lord Mahon. I don't think I talk about this in the book, but Mahon is writing this big history of England, and he gets to the revolution of the American colonies, and he's reading Sparks's publication of Washington's writings, and he's noticing disparities between specific letters that Sparks has included there and those same letters which have been published separately in another document, not to get too much into the weeds. And this becomes this like back and forth where Lord Mahon, this noble elite political figure in England, is arguing in the press with Jared Sparks about what is the authentic writing of Washington. Sparks is defending himself. Mahon is casting doubt on his edits. There's one fascinating document where these two different versions of the same letter of Washington are juxtaposed, one next to another, and you can see just very, very significant and also some insignificant changes between the two, raising the larger question of like what is the true historical document? What should we depend on? What can we not depend on? As well as the question of what are the responsibilities or the liberties that historians can take when trying to make sense of the past. What is the true document? What is not the true document? All these questions were at stake in this period too. Again, one at a moment when the historical discipline doesn't quite exist yet, doesn't have its formal structures yet, and these materials become part of that larger process.
Thank you. Um, so Carl is also thinking about the commercial aspects of collecting and selling
Mhm.
archival materials during this time
Right.
period and its impact on the preservation and loss of important materials.
I wouldn't have recommended it as a career path if you were like going out of college. I work with college students, so I wouldn't if they if they were graduating in the 1820s, I wouldn't say like go into archival collecting and manuscript trading and publication. Sparks, for instance, just to continue that example, at the tail end of having like done all this labor of accessing materials, reading through them, editing, going through the publication process, says like, I haven't made any money from this. He thinks the amount of labor he put into it uh, in no way was compensated by the book contracts and other forms of remuneration he had. So I don't know that there was much of a literal market of exchange of documents for money that would have justified this as or motivated people that extensively to do it. Though I could be wrong, and it'd be interesting to know about examples of people who made more money. There are certainly booksellers, sellers of historical books and manuscripts who succeed in this period. To take an instance, Obadiah Rich, an American who is based in Europe for the large part. He has a consular posting. Interesting aspect of this world. A lot of people, they obtain federal government appointments as consular officers or diplomats in some cases, and use those as an opportunity to access materials in other countries. And Obadiah Rich lived in Spain and gathered this huge assortment of materials, he was a bibliophile, some of which he sold. So it wasn't impossible to make some money from participating in this world, but it was more an economy of, we might say, like sentiment and curiosity. That William Buell Spragg, as I noted before, he exchanged pieces of paper with people in exchange for other pieces of paper, and so it was something else that was binding people together rather than making a literal profit.
Great, thank you. Um, so let's see. Um, Miriam is wondering about whether you've traced any evolutions of the local and state histories as they morphed into the 1870s county
Yeah.
history and atlas projects, and then the WPA series.
I haven't. I think just for, we draw lines in projects,
Yeah.
of course, and obviously a familiar one is the Civil War, which is where my research petered out. There's a logic to that, and that the Civil War changed many things in terms of how history was collected, the institutions that emerged. One book I'd recommend. I'm sorry if this isn't very responsive to the question, but to kind of go beyond the chronology that my book covers is called War on Record. It's by Yael Sternhell. It was a wonderful article that this was written maybe a decade ago now that this emerged from. It has to do with the archives of the Civil War and gets more into the federal response and efforts related to the archives of war and the larger work of collecting material. So that might help bring the curious reader into the second half of the 19th century in a good way. So I would recommend that book.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. I think we'll say that this is our last one because
Sure.
I find this one fascinating. How do you see teachers and genealogists using your book?
That's a really great question. And I'd be curious to know if people are using it, how they found it useful themselves. It raises larger themes and context about the period in the first chapter. And I think for someone within the discipline, someone who is conducting their own genealogical research or works at an institution or uh, is a employee or pursuing a career in whether a library or an archive, I would hope that it's useful to look at the sort of early efforts to do that for both similarities and differences that you detect in the ways that Americans, again, certain Americans, this book does not encompass all of the work to gather historical materials, but how these institutions thought about what they were doing. Um, what is similar or dissimilar from your own experience working in these institutions? Are there themes that connect or tendencies that connect across historical periods? I hope it would be helpful for that purpose. The four chapters, which I briefly spotlighted before, each cover different institutions and different types of historical collecting and writing. And so I would hope that one could turn to those and kind of cherry pick as needed to explore one of those aspects. If you work in a local historical society, you're interested in genealogy, for instance, I'd suggest looking at the chapter on Francis Manmore and Calkins, which serves to bring the reader into that world. If you're curious about the international exchange of ideas and how American institutions like fit into a broader kind of global community of collectors and historical writers, Raffin's chapter might strike your interest. So I think depending on where one's working and their curiosity, you could kind of pull out chapters to explore those too.
I love that. Yeah, it does seem to have a nice modularity that would work well for that purpose. So, well, this has been wonderful, super enlightening. And yeah, we've all learned some names that we may not have known before
Good.
in helping us to think about these collections of history. So, thank you so much for being here, everyone. And thanks so much, Derek, for taking the time to walk us through your research and your book. And thanks, Cheney, for great conversation. And have a great weekend, everybody.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. If anyone wishes to follow up, I'm more than happy. I've left my email in the chat, so don't hesitate to reach out.
Great. Thank you. Bye bye.